To all those who don't know me, my name is Kristin Kuhns. I'm adjunct faculty for German Studies at Seton Hill University and also here at WCCC. So that's a little bit about me. I have a bachelor's degree from Smith College in German culture and language. I also have a master's degree in teaching from the University of Pittsburgh. I've been teaching for WCCC for about 3 years, since about the pandemic, and at Seton Hill for about a year. So that's a little bit about my background. I also teach writing at Ligonier Valley School District. I've taught there for 16, 17 years. So I've taught German there when they had a German program, and I teach English and writing. So I've taught that for a number of years now as well. This is actually about one of my passions, which is the Empress Elisabeth of Austria-Hungary. I wrote my honors thesis about her at Smith College in 2000, 2001, and finally actually just published my book through Amazon publishing last May, and it's had a couple different evolutions since then that I've gone through with some students actually contributing to translations and such. So I should probably advance the slide because I think that's on the next one. So what the basis of my book and my thesis is that the Empress Elisabeth of Austria-Hungary, and here we're talking about like the 1800s, she was born in 1837, died in 1898, to kind of give you an orientation of what time period we're talking about. She was very instrumental in the formation of her own legend. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit today. We're also going to talk about the overarching thesis of my work, which I'm continuing in a part 2, which is that the way that she is portrayed primarily in film, but also in books and in musicals that came out of Austria and Germany, really parallel the zeitgeist of the time. So the contemporary feelings of the time period, a lot having to do with how women are viewed and how that's changed throughout the decades, primarily starting in the 1950s and then going through the late 90s and through the 2000s. And I'm continuing that work in part 2, where I'm going to examine some of the more recent iterations, which we'll also discuss here. She's really had a resurgence and a lot of reimaginings through the film Corsage, which just came out and won some German film prizes, and actually was almost nominated for an Oscar in the international, film area. And also there's a Sissy RTL miniseries that is being developed right now. Season 3 is about to come out, and probably something that most of you might have more association with is the Netflix series, The Empress. That's also been greenlit for season 2, which should be coming out, I think, in the next year. So there's been a recent resurgence of interest in her, which has been, translated through these different imaginings. So I'm going to continue with part 2 with my thesis of seeing how that lines up with post-feminine ideals and feminism, you'll see, of the 1970s, the 1950s. So just basically how she's being reimagined through different decades. So we'll start with just some basics about her, because it's hard to understand the thesis and how that comes to fruition. So she was born in Munich, Germany in 1837. She was actually assassinated by an Italian anarchist in 1898 in Geneva, and his name was Luigi Lucchini. And she is the wife of Emperor Franz Joseph I. So the Habsburgs are, maybe you're familiar with Franz Joseph or Joseph II, who, if you've seen Amadeus, he's the emperor in Amadeus. And she's also related, so she's related to him through her husband. That might be, something that you can grab out to make an association. So we're talking about the Habsburg monarchy. This is not the emperor that was assassinated. This is not Archduke Franz Ferdinand. This is before him. And actually, Archduke Franz Ferdinand came to power because their son committed suicide. He was supposed to be next in line. So just to give you a little bit of an orientation of who we're talking about. So in Austria and in Germany and throughout Europe, she's really an iconic cult figure. She's really likened a lot to Princess Diana. People know who she is a lot by this, and I can use the 50 pointer here, the Winterhalter portrait, which here you'll see mostly in Vienna. part of her myth or her legend, some of the hallmarks are her eccentric beauty. She had floor-length chestnut brown hair, allegedly a 16-inch waist, which was made smaller through extreme corseting. She was, into extreme exercise, and she fasted, and it was believed by modern standards that she probably would have been diagnosed with anorexia. She was instrumental in the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1830 or 1867. At the time, her husband had a lot of personal vendettas against some of the dukes and counts of the Hungarian Empire, and she was really instrumental in smoothing out that relationship between the Hungarian royalty and the Habsburg monarchy. So that's how it became Austria-Hungary, is a lot through some of her, her acting as a liaison between those countries. She was an accomplished equestrian, a poet in her own right, and there's actually a published anthology of her poems by Brigitte Haumann. I believe it was in 1982. And a big admirer of Heinrich Heine. So for those of you who know anything about, German culture, she really venerated him and looked up to him, and actually believed that she could commune with his ghost and that he would dictate these poems to her. She was a connoisseur of the Greek language and culture. She had a palace on Corfu, which I've been to, that was called the Achilleon, where, it's named after Achilles, and there's this big Achilles statue there. So that was kind of a decade of her life where she was very interested in that. She was a restless traveler. She spent a lot of time, because she had sicknesses, which are now thought to be possibly STDs, also maybe mental emotional. In Madeira, Corfu, England, Hungary, Spain, and Portugal, she had palaces, or she had a palace. Its name is Gurdaler in Hungary. It's outside of Budapest. I've been there as well. I've been to Corfu. She stayed at different palaces of, other royal figures in England, and that's where she did a lot of her riding. Again, she probably, by modern standards, would have been diagnosed with depression. She suffered a lot of what they would have called melancholy at the time. And she played, as I said earlier, an active role in molding her image in her lifetime through portraiture and some photography. And there's actually a great book by a colleague of mine, Olivia Kruger-Flora, who goes into the Winterhalter portraits. The Winterhalter portrait, which you can see right here, and digs into what do these flowers mean, and what does this mean that she has this in her hair, and how she's not, traditionally shown like other royals of the time with a crown and with crown jewels, and with her hand placed in certain placements, and she's an expert on this. But so that's a really interesting read. I think it's called Celebrity Monarch, and she actually teaches in Pennsylvania as well. Okay, so that's a little bit about her. So this is my book. This is part one, which I said, before, covers 1859, and I started at that point because that's when she started to really cultivate her own legend herself. And it goes until 2000, probably late 1990s, 1992, with the musical Elisabeth. So this started as an honors thesis at Smith College for me in 2001. And my overarching thesis, like I said, is that these main hallmarks of her legend are present in all of these different iterations of her, but then they are changed, sometimes slightly, sometimes majorly, to be really parallel to the zeitgeist of the time. I also have her myth permeates modern culture in all media forms. So in the book, it goes over books, movies, the major musical that came out in 1992. And this was self-published through Amazon. And I'm thinking about part two, once I come out with that, marrying the two together and publishing with an established publisher. So the first part of her legend that you would briefly need to understand would be what's called the Romy Sissy archetype. So this is Romy Schneider. She's a popular actress of the time. She also played in some movies in France after World War II, to escape, Nazi Germany and all the negative associations with that. So the Romy Sissy archetype is very much an example of what's called the Heimat film, or the homeland films of the 1950s that you see coming out of Germany and Austria. that the whole purpose of those films was to harken back to a better time, an easier, simpler time. And in this case, it's to the Habsburg monarchy in the 1800s, that, you know, mid 1800s to late 1800s. And that being shown as a better, easier time for the Germans and for the Austrians, that was far removed from the problematic, you know, Nazi past and associations. So that's a little bit about the Heimat films. It was very nostalgic towards the Habsburg Empire, so very positive towards them. There's very little problems in these movies. So a lot of the depression, the anorexia, some of the things I mentioned before, are absolutely not present in these films at all. She's very much portrayed as the 1950s housewife who takes care of her husband and her children, very dutiful. There's actually a scene, which maybe if we have time later, I could play for you, where they, her husband and her Franz Josef, and again, none of this is not true or substantiated with any facts, but in the movie, they make a trip to Tyrol, incognito, disguised, and get to have a simple day as man and wife in what's called a Hütte, like a little cabin in the Alps. And she shines his shoes for him and makes him food and things like that. So that's very much linked to the 1950s housewife archetype, you could call it. It's very melodramatic, and the Technicolor, even the colors used in the film are very much like, think Wizard of Oz, like, you know, very hyper pigmented. Again, she's very adoring and doting on her husband, Franz Josef, which is not at all, you know, couched in truth. I wouldn't say after the 1850s, 1860s, I think the relationship changed dramatically. She's always in a good mood. She's always smiling. She's always agreeable. And again, it's very far removed from the historical figure of Elisabeth. The fact that she and Franz Josef and the other, you know, royals that are depicted in these movies, which it's a trilogy, it's kind of called Menschen wie du und ich. So the royals are personified as being just like everyday folk, you know, and especially in that scene that I described where they're in Tyrol in the mountains, and you know, she's just a regular, you know, person. She's not an empress. So a lot of those films, you know, that's kind of the overarching theme, is that these people are just like us. So that's a little bit about that. So Romy Schneider was, for her entire life, linked to Elisabeth and Sissy. And so Sissy is, with one S, is kind of her nickname. Okay, so that's allegedly what her husband and her relatives called her. But the films by Ernst Marischka are with two S's. So usually when you see Sissy with two S's, they're referring to the films. And when it's with one S, it's referring to her nickname. Okay, or if she's called Elisabeth with an S, you know, that's obviously her longer, more official name. So just to clarify that a little bit. But Romy Schneider was linked to her own, you know, well, I guess it was a good and a bad thing. She gained a lot of popularity through it, but she hated that association. It's kind of like what we think about with Marilyn Monroe, hating those, you know, iconic roles that made her famous as a blonde bombshell and wanting to be seen as a deeper, more serious actress. It was kind of a similar thing with Romy Schneider and with Sissy. You know, she gained a lot of fame through the role, but she began to hate that she was always linked to this figure, and also not historically based at all. So the next one that I can highlight, and again, I fill in the gaps in the book, so these are just the highlights. She actually made a comeback in 1972 with a very good, very serious director, Luchino Visconti, who's Italian. And he filmed a kind of a dramatic bio of Ludwig der Zweite, or Ludwig II, who is, we know him as Crazy King Louis. If you've seen Neuschwanstein, that beautiful castle that everyone associates with Germany, he's the one who built that. So that is her cousin. So even though the film is about him, she figures largely in that film, okay, as Elisabeth. And even as you can see from the pictures that right here, you can tell that even the coloring, I mean, this is in black and white, obviously, but here the coloring is a lot more muted, okay? So this was made in 1972. So how she's portrayed here is very different from the 1950s version. Same actress, but she took this role so that she could kind of course correct with her career and wouldn't constantly be linked with this bubbly, overly happy sissy archetype. This is the more serious Elisabeth. This has a lot more basis in truth. And here she's called Empress Elisabeth or Kaiserin Elisabeth in German. You can find this translated into English. It's obviously originally in Italian. I believe Romy Schneider was fluent in Italian, French, English, German, but you can find it in English. She plays an older, more mature Elisabeth, so also the time period is different. The Sissy films take place mostly through their marriage, so 1854, so when they meet and fall in love, and then follow through till about the early 1860s. It only covers those, first about decade or so of their marriage. Whereas Ludwig der Zweite covers her as an older woman and much more mature. I would say that's for the 1880s. Some of the same hallmarks of her legend you will see in this film, like her being an avid rider and equestrian, the long hair, which you can actually kind of see a little bit of here. But here she's much more portrayed as an emancipated woman. She's independent. She's very bitter. There are a few lines about how bitter she is about her role as Empress and how much she resents that. She does reference her depression, her restlessness, and her traveling, and her overall disappointment in life, which is absolutely grounded in fact and grounded in the most famous biographical work by Brigitte Hamann that came out in the 1980s. So this was clearly influenced by the women's movement of the 1960s and 70s. She's never shown in the film with her husband. She traveled without him. She basically lives out her passion, does what she wants, and she's in command in every scene. So there's really a stark contrast between the two of them. And then the third one that I wanted to highlight was Elisabeth, the musical, which came out in 1992. This I like to call, and I called it the book, the Todesengel image, which is the death angel image of her. This is much more gothic. So think 1990s, goth. So again, very in line with the contemporary music, Nirvana and Marilyn Manson kind of the time. The music is not like that, but the staging, the choreography, the costumes are like that. This covers her entire life. So basically, well, not from birth, but about from her teenage years to her death and her assassination. Death, or Der Tod, is actually a character in the musical. That's right here. That's the original actor who played him, Uwe Kruger. They actually are still doing this musical. I just saw it in Vienna this summer. It was an open air version of it that was done in front of Schloss Schönbrunn, which was one of the palaces that she actually lived at, which was really, really a really neat experience, different from how I've ever seen it before. I've seen it 2 other times. So Death is actually the character. He tries to seduce her repeatedly throughout the musical, trying to get her to commit suicide. So it's very dark, very different from the Sissy films for sure. Lucchini, I mentioned her assassin, is also a character in the film or in the musical, and he accompanies her through her life as kind of an observer who comments on things. It really reminds me of, if you know Che from the musical Evita, how he comments constantly on her and what she's doing and interacts with her as a character. That it's very, very much like that. Her melancholy and depression and anorexia, and even the possibility of her having an STD contracted from her husband, are part of the musical. So much more based in research and biographical facts. So there are some scenes from that, but I have a few pictures there so that you get the idea. So that is basically where the book concludes and aligns it with, the contemporary, ideal femininity, ideal, woman of the time. So that's where I kind of left off. What happened since? This is an article in the New York Times that I actually happened upon last October, so about a year ago, that talks about this recent resurgence, and it says the Empress ahead of her time is having a pop culture moment. So here in the article, it discusses the Netflix series, which you can see right here, which will have a second season. And that really, for the first time, brought her into the consciousness of the American audience, because Americans usually don't know who this is. As a matter of fact, it was kind of funny when we were in Vienna this summer. My husband, when he first went into one of the castles, the Hofburg, looked around and saw all these different, started to see pictures of her and was like, wow, this is really a thing. And I said, yeah, it is. We just don't use an American, aren't familiar with her. So that was a major breakthrough with American audiences, is how that Netflix series, a lot of people are becoming familiar with her, even though there's very little fact. It's not very fact-based. It's very, dramatic. It's a historical period drama with very little that's actually true about the Empress. This also talks about, like I mentioned, the RTL Sissy miniseries that's come out in Germany, and Corsage. And then there's been another one, which you can't see from the screenshot of the article, that I'm still waiting to see, which was called Sissy und Ich, which is about her relationship with one of her ladies in waiting, specifically in Greece. And I haven't been able to see it yet because I couldn't get it on DVD or Blu-ray or anything yet. I think I should be able to get it this fall. So that's another recent iteration. So all of these have been in quick succession. So literally in the past year and a half, all of these different things have come to fruition. So that's why they wrote this article. In tandem with this, when I was starting to reawaken my, interest and my passion in this and revisit my thesis, I found out that I was actually quoted in one of the major books that's come out since I wrote my thesis, which is called Sissy's World, with 2 S's. That's by Hametz and Schnittake. And they are 2 American professors who basically have come up with a culmination of essays about how Elisabeth is different iterations of her in sculpture, in art, in film, in musicals, not in books, artistic media, mostly like that, okay? But those essays do not have an overarching thesis. It doesn't culminate in any kind of, idea, or they're isolated essays. So I found that book, and in the introduction, I was actually quoted. So that was really interesting and neat to see. That ran in tandem with me finding this article. So this was kind of the impetus for me wanting to get my work published finally. So I thought I would do something a little bit different, and something that I've noticed, and maybe this is good for the younger crowd who are interested in Taylor Swift. There is definitely a parallel between how Taylor Swift has crafted her own image in media through her music and her fashion, and Empress Elisabeth, and how her image was crafted by herself and then by others later after her death. So I thought that was something that would be really interesting and different to explore. So now that you know a little bit about Empress Elisabeth, what does that have to do with Taylor Swift? So I watched on Netflix, there's an interesting, let's say it's a documentary on Taylor Swift. It's called Miss Americana. I don't know if you've seen it. But she says the female artists have reinvented themselves 20 times more than the male artists. They have to, or else they're out of a job, constantly having to reinvent, constantly finding new facets of yourself that people find to be shiny. Be new to us, be young to us, but only in a new way, and only in the way we want. And reinvent yourself, but only in a way that we find to be equally comforting, but also a challenge for you. So that quote really stuck out to me when I watched that documentary that she said about reinventing herself. And I'm sure she's not the only artist that has brought this forth. I'm sure, there are associations with Madonna, with Beyonce. There are different musical artists, especially who are women, who have reinvented themselves over and over and over again. But I saw an interesting video that was actually on YouTube about the different eras of Taylor Swift. And that's what got me thinking about this. She's had multi-generational success. So we're talking about 16 years of eras and different, aspects of her personality and her interests and her passions that she's molded into kind of iconic portions of her personality. In the video, it discusses how she has lore and fashion, and there's kind of a deep culture to the Swiftie phenomenon. And I learned a lot about, I didn't know that much about Taylor Swift. I don't consider myself a Swiftie, and I'm not cool enough to go to one of her concerts, but I learned a lot about her from this video. That the 10 albums that she's done culminated in this Eras tour, and that's actually, you can see that's why I picked this graphic. And correct me if I'm wrong, these do show some of her different, the different iterations of her personalities or her eras. Okay, I think that's also it's permeated our culture, because I've heard other YouTubers, use this kind of phrase of "I'm in my blank era." People are saying that now. That's become kind of a catchphrase. It's a cultural phenomenon. And that really aligns with Elisabeth, and I'll get into that. So apparently during this concert, she comes out in different costumes for each era of her tour. And specifically in one of her music videos, I believe it's "Look What You Made Me Do." I think that's it. At the end, and that's maybe where she got the idea for this tour, there are different iterations or different aspects of her personality that come center stage at the end of the music video. And they're, different characters, if you will, from her different, songs and albums, and how she was, known with iconic fashion and iconic songs attached to it. And she, that happens at the end of that music video, which may have been the impetus for this tour, because it kind of follows that idea. The costumes are used as stories in her tour, and it's a signal to the audience, and people dress up as different, characters from her eras. And I think that, she's so relatable, because the audience sees a version of themselves reflected back at them. They pick whatever is most, relevant to them, maybe, and that's who they dress up as. So I think that's why she has been popular for so long and continues to be popular, and this continues to be like a cultural phenomenon. In her music videos and in the tour, fashion is a tangible element. So how she is dressed and represents herself, as is true with Empress Elisabeth of Austria too, is a tangible element to the lore, to the Taylor Swift phenomenon. And each new album is new fashion and a new character. So when she comes out at the end of that music video that I described, and I think there are pictures here later, those are some of the examples. She's almost a different character. So I think she picked different aspects, which was reflected in the quote, different aspects of her personality to highlight that she's assigned a costume to, and an album, and several songs to. And here, it's probably too small for you to see. And again, we could probably go into it for hours. I'm actually thinking of writing a journal article about this too, and going really in depth as to the lyrics aligning with the character in each era, and how that lines up with Empress Elisabeth. But kind of the highlights are, she started out as an all-American country girl in 2006. The fashion was blue jeans, black dress, cowboy boots, very relatable, okay? A kind of all-American girl image. To me, when this happened in tandem with me thinking about Sissy, I thought about the Sissy films. That's very much like the Sissy films, the all-American girl, okay? Very relatable. It could be anybody. And then she goes through a couple of other eras: boho chic, which is denoted with sundresses, affordable fashion, cowboy boots, relatable and authentic. She's one of you, which again, she's one of you. That goes back to Herrscher wie du und ich. So the royals being represented as people like a regular person. Then she enters the red era, with straight hair, bangs, kitten heels, Oxford. So I have a whole list there of the fashion that denotes that, which also was reflective of the time. 1989 is in there. Reputation. This is another thing that I harken back to Sissy. Her Reputation era, grunge curls, most dramatic chain, rock and roll. This is where I think she had the snake when she was playing off of what Kanye West and the whole, if I'm correct about that, somebody called her a snake, and she used it in her act. Much darker, much more, rock and roll, kind of left the all-American country girl persona, and reemerged with the Reputation era. That to me was kind of like the Elisabeth musical, so much darker. So I just thought it was interesting, and this keeps going with cottagecore. This was during COVID, Midnights, which is 70s glam, Lavender Haze, was one of the songs in that album. And again, I'm no Taylor Swift expert, but I thought it was interesting that some of the same points were hit in the development of the Elisabeth or sissy myth. That the all-American country girl was kind of like the 1950s. And actually, I think I have a slide on that. Yes, I do. So I kind of lined it up when I started thinking about it. So the young sissy, this is actually during her life. This is her as a bride. I guess I don't need to go this far close to it, do I? I could just do this. This was a painting painted of her when she was first a bride in the 1850s. So representing childhood, innocence, very close association to animals and nature, romantic love, very virginal. This could be aligned with the American country girl image with the sundress, boho chic, cottagecore. Okay, so that is being the start of Taylor Swift's career and the start of what you could call Elisabeth's career as Empress. This young sissy is what's very heavily reflected 100 years later in the sissy films. Then the middle is the more mature Elisabeth. That's the 1860s and 1870s. She's much more accomplished. This is kind of the salient image right here of the Diamant Stern in Mars, so the diamond stars in her hair, the Winterhalter portrait. The Ausgleich with Hungary, the compromise with Hungary in 1867. So that's kind of mature Elisabeth, 1860s, 1870s. That kind of correlated to me, and I wanted to do more research on this for that article, as the red era in 1989. Okay, so much more mature Taylor Swift, her music was much more mature, her fashion changed. But again, very iconic and recognizable. And then the last one, and I kind of tried to drill it down into three succinct ideas. The older Totus Angle image of Elisabeth from the 1880s, 1898, where she's disillusioned, restlessly traveling, melancholic, depressed, grieving mother. As I had mentioned before, her son committed suicide in 1889 in Meyerling with his mistress. She was really, never recovered from that. And this is reflected most in the Elisabeth musical from 1992. So that goth image of her in black. So here you can see that, always dressed in black with a white umbrella, with a fan. She obscured her face, after basically her 40s. She did not want to be seen anymore. And all of the representations of her, whether it's in portrait form or photography, she either has her face obscured by a fan, or if it's a painting, they've used, younger images to inform how they painted her to make her still look young. And this image is from the Hofburg, which is the interstate Capitol Palace in Vienna, which I just saw. They have those three kind of images of her or ideas of her, iterations of her, how she's represented with her hairstyles. So here, I believe, is supposed to be the young virginal bride. Here in the middle is supposed to be the more mature Elisabeth from the 1860s, 1870s, and here in the end is supposed to be more the death angel image, where she only dressed in black and her hair is higher up here, braided, kind of in a crown around her head. So they even drilled it down to three basic images. And so, like I had said before, the Totus Angle image relates to the Reputation era, where, Taylor Swift wears more black. There's more association with death and grunge. And right here, you can see that this is from one of her concerts. And then this is what I was speaking about before at the end of that, song, Look What You Made Me Do, I think is what it's called. Again, I'm not a Swiftie and not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but this is at the end of that. You can see how it's her, but dressed differently with different fashion as different eras of her career. So I thought that was really interesting that you could draw those comparisons between them. And I thought it was an interesting point as far as pop culture. So, and I said some of these things already, what do they have in common? So I always ask myself, why the Empress Elisabeth? There are a lot of empresses and emperors and people that, have been in power. Why is she an enduring legend and someone that keeps speaking to the public, in some way? There must be some reason for that. And why is Taylor Swift still, popular, and why are people attending her concerts? So they both have recognizable, iconic fashion. So like I showed you from the representations here earlier, you can tell once you read a biography of Elisabeth or you know anything about her, if you see this, or you see this, you know what time period we're talking about from her life. It's very easy. If she's wearing all black fan, there's another painting of her with a white umbrella. This is older Elisabeth. This is clearly 1860s Elisabeth. This is earlier, you know, childhood, teenage bride Elisabeth. It's the same thing with Taylor Swift, as you can kind of see here. So depending on her fashion and how she's portraying herself, because it's so simple, it's very, you know, iconic and very easy to grab on. You know which Taylor Swift era that you're talking about. Both are masterminds of their own image. So I didn't really talk about that as much here in the presentation, but in the book I address that. And it's also addressed in that book that I mentioned called Celebrity Monarch, that she was a mastermind of her own image, which is really different from the women of the time period. They really didn't have maybe the self-awareness to craft their own image. They didn't take charge enough in the way they were portrayed in media to craft their own image. So that was something that was really different and extraordinary about Empress Elisabeth in her time period, and something that probably is extraordinary about Taylor Swift being the mastermind of her image, being able to do it so effectively. And like I said, I don't think she's the only one. Madonna definitely comes to mind. Beyonce definitely comes to mind. And they have similar arcs as well, which I would be interested in further researching. The need to reinvent oneself to remain relevant. Both Empress Elisabeth and Taylor Swift have done that. And I think it was also in line with the time period. So I had mentioned earlier about the cottagecore era right here. That was in reaction to COVID. Going back to nature, a lot of her songs are about that, and a lot of her music videos are very nature-based, very like, you know, cabin, cozy, you know, as we were all home during COVID. So a lot of this, again, is in response to what's going on at the time, which Empress Elisabeth also did. There's a cycle that everything that goes out of style comes back into style again. So some of Taylor Swift's fashion and some of Empress Elisabeth's fashion was based on fashion ideals that had been abandoned and then were reinvented, reimagined, and brought back to life through both of those women. And again, I could go into that more, and Olivia Gruber-Florek also does a wonderful job of that, specifically with art and portraiture. They're both relatable and authentic, or can give some type of authentic, some type of authenticity that one would believe that, you know, that they are genuine. So like I described, Hair Shirt Veer, Princess of the People, that was something else that I wanted to talk about in relation to Princess Diana. I think that's why everyone still sees her as an icon. And this is also actually, this Princess of the People concept is something that I'm going to explore further in part 2 of my book, because that's really brought up a lot. I believe it might be in The Empress on Netflix, where she crowd surfs when she's pregnant with her first child, which obviously has no basis in historical fact. But her really having a close relationship with the common person, and being this Princess of the People or Empress of the People, like Princess Diana. They're clearly trying to draw those parallels in her representations that have just come out in the past year and a half. So that's why I wanted to bring up the relatability and the authenticity factors. The patterns I talked about, Madonna and Beyonce also having similar patterns. And through the fashion and through music being, with Taylor Swift, being easily identifiable. So this is a quote that I read in the Celebrity Monarch, which was actually taken from someone else, by Brody from The Frenzy of the Renown, page 5. And this is about celebrity. So in part, 20th century fame celebrates uniqueness, and in part requires that uniqueness be exemplary and reproducible. So I thought that was really interesting, the reproducible part. That goes back to why people dress up when they go to Taylor Swift concerts. What only kings could accomplish in the past is now available for aspirants of more modest means. So that quote really spoke to me again as the parallel between Empress Elisabeth and Taylor Swift. And again, here are some of the different eras, from the tour. So that is it. Again, I could show some scenes from different films to make the point more clear, but I thought I'd spend some time answering questions and finding out what you might be more interested in. But I'd like to explore the concept further in a journal article and really hone in on some of the lyrics that might, from Taylor Swift's albums and from the different eras that link back to the myth and how Empress Elisabeth has different iterations. So thank you for being here, but I'll take questions. Go ahead. Oh, well, that's a great question. My husband just asked me that, and my son asked me that. I was studying German. I was at my junior year abroad in Hamburg, and obviously trying to learn the language, very overwhelmed with being in a foreign country. My mother's German, but she never taught me German. I learned German in high school, much like, my students have. So I was studying my junior year abroad, and I found a small short. It was probably intended for teenagers, not an adult book, but more of probably a middle schooler book by, in German about Empress Elisabeth, and I still have it. And I started reading that, and I don't know why I picked it. I probably picked it because I liked the portrait on the front looked nice, or I don't even know why I bought it, but I bought it and I read it, and I thought she was so interesting. And that really became the motivation to read more and more. And at the time, there was only one TV in the entire place where I stayed with other students in the dorms. And so I wasn't watching a lot of TV. And so I bought book after book after book and just ravenously read about her and, read the Brigitte Baumann biography, and then the Egon Kaiser Corti biography. Those are the two premier pieces of biographical text about her. And then ravenously read like her poems. It's called Das Poetische Tagebuch. I have that as well. And then some other, just other books, just kept buying them and reading them. And of course, that obviously improved my German because I was reading, ravenously after classes and things, and really knew a lot of vocabulary that maybe other students didn't know because the vocabulary that I developed centered on these themes. So that's kind of how it started. And then because I was in Europe, I traveled, I was close to some of these places. So I traveled to Geneva. I traveled with a friend who's Hungarian to Gödeler because her parents lived in Budapest. So it worked out beautifully. And traveled to, my family is from Munich. So, she's from Munich. So there was a natural, parallel there. And I've been to Vienna many times. I loved Vienna. The running joke in my family is if I'm missing, I'm in Vienna. That's where you should probably look for me. And I was able to go to Corfu, which is an island off the coast of Greece. I went there 2 times. I saw the Achilleon. The only place I haven't been is Madeira, and never to Spain or Portugal. So none of those places, or to the places in England where she stayed, but everywhere else I've been to. So that's kind of how it started and kind of became a big passion of mine. Okay, my students have to ask some questions now. Something. Should give you an easy question. Good one. Yes.
What era really goes to?
Ooh, that's a good one. I don't know. That's a really deep question. I don't know that I've thought about that explicitly. I would say it changes. I think like when I was younger, maybe the younger iteration, and maybe as I get older, I relate more to the older version. I think it depends on age, because you'll see this in the book and also in the biographies. Some of the struggles that she was going through were traditional struggles of, when she was younger, early years of marriage and raising children and things like that. So you can identify more with that when you're younger and you're going through that. And then as she aged, her aging was a big topic that was discussed in the biography, and her trying to obscure her face and dealing with aging as a woman, which I can much more relate to now. So I think it depends on, what period you are in your life. That's a very good question. else? Georgia's got to ask a question. Laura's got to ask a question. One each. You have, okay, we'll give them a little bit of time. Go ahead.
So I'm curious about like their in certain words, I guess, like there's like anything like the parallels are here. But is there something like expressive?
I like the word trajectory. Like pattern
Yeah, like
that you could apply.
They're having
I would say that, and I think I tried to bring home that point there in the end. I can't, because I haven't studied it as much. I can't say that for Beyonce necessarily, or for Madonna necessarily.
that's what I was asking about general.
In general, yeah. I do think there is something to be said, and again, I'd have to do further research in it to have any kind of believability about it. About the same pattern, or what you said, I think that's an excellent word, is trajectory to image and myth, and developing one's image and myth. And how does that start? Because it seems to always start in the maidenhood, maybe that's a good way to say it. Maidenhood, the younger, more innocent, country girl for Taylor Swift. And you could also call Elisabeth a country girl, because she was raised, in a very, farm-like atmosphere in Hossenhofen outside of Munich. So you could also make that association. Maybe that's the starting, the innocence of, maidenhood, starting that out as an archetype to parallel with your career and how you're, producing your image. And then also its development over years. And does that become darker? And maybe it does because of life, because that happens to us all, right? Some of us become jaded after experiencing, tragedies or, the harshness of real life. I think that's going to do that to anybody. And I think you can see that as we look at how both of these women are personified and reimagined, through the fashion, especially with Taylor Swift. So does that make sense? I think you could say that. I would have to do further research, and I said, I want to do a lot more research on the Taylor Swift thing, because I don't know the lyrics, I don't know the details, and I want to really dig into that. I think it would be really interesting. And also then to mention Beyonce and Madonna as also replicating that pattern, because it works. But the thing to remember about Taylor Swift and that video that I based some of my very superficial knowledge of her on, is that the critical thing that she's doing is she's marrying that pattern or trajectory, whatever you want to call that, right? She's marrying that with what is going on at the time in a creative way. So that cottage core that really came out of COVID, or capitalizing at first on the country music, imagining of her with the sundress and the cowboy boots, she's marrying that also with the zeitgeist of the time. She somehow really, or the people around her, maybe not her, maybe her, people that are marketing her, are very decisively, have their finger on cultural phenomenon, and then taking that and blending it with this pattern to produce something that's going to be marketable, consumable, and relatable for folks, for especially the younger generation, and even the older generation, because there were women and men in their 40s and 50s going to those concerts as well, and still are. Yes. Which one, Empress Elisabeth? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So actually, it's interesting that you brought that up, because she was assassinated on the 10th of September, 1898. So we just celebrated the 125th anniversary of her death, which was a big deal. So yes, at the time there are drawings and representations of her funeral procession. of her being laid to rest. And, you know, there are statues all around Vienna that were dedicated. There's one in the Volksgarten, which I took a picture next to, and, you know, you can see pictures of Franz Josef dedicating that statue to her in like 1916, or I think somewhere around there. So yeah, her death really was a cultural phenomenon, not only just something newsworthy, that caught people's attention at the time, much like Princess Diana. And they both had tragic deaths, right? So Princess Diana died in an automobile accident, being, you know, chased by the paparazzi, right? Or at least that's the story that we've heard. And she was killed by an Italian anarchist, which ironically, when Luigi Lucchini came to Geneva that day, or the days preceding, the 10th of September, he was not there to assassinate her. He was there to assassinate I think it was the King of Orleans or something. It was someone else that was more a part of the Italian aristocracy and royal family. He didn't come to kill her. But then that person who he was there to kill and assassinate never showed up. And he heard, just locally hanging out at bars and such, that she was there. And she was obviously a member of the royal family. And he was doing this in an act to show that, you know, to demonstrate against, you know, a dictatorship basically of sorts with the royal family. But what he didn't know was that if he had talked to her, she was actually very progressive and liberal thinking. She would have agreed with him about his ideas about, you know, democracy and having a representation from the people, by the people, which the United States obviously founded with their ideals. So she would have totally agreed with him. Ironically, but he did stab her with a file in the heart. And she didn't realize, as a matter of fact, at the time that had anything had happened, because she was bound so tightly by her corset and everything that she was wearing. And she was wearing so much black clothing and all the clothing over, you know, the corsets and the different undergarments that was bound so tightly, it kept the blood in. But they didn't realize anything until she boarded the boat. And one of her ladies in waiting let the captain know that she was bleeding. She did start to see, like, she fainted and she was bleeding. And she told him to stop the boat, turn it around. And he said, well, I'm not, you know, turning the boat around for some lady. And she said, that's the Empress of Austria, Hungary. They didn't even know who she was because she was traveling under a pseudonym, under the Gräfin from Kuhns, or the Baroness of Kuhns. So they didn't know who she was. And then they rushed her to the Bord Navage, which is the hotel right there, which I've been to right there on where the boats dock. And that's the hotel she stayed at, and rushed her in there, and that's where she passed away, was actually there. But they did not realize at first what had happened. And she thought she'd just been struck and fell backwards. They didn't know that he had a file that he stabbed her. And they caught him right away, actually. And there's a photo of him walking quite happily and triumphantly with two guards, you know, policemen, whatever, next to him. And he then later hung himself in his cell. I want to say within a week. You know, very kind of almost similar to the Kennedy assassination, with Oswald being killed and then never really knowing a lot more about it because he died. And that's actually in the musical, is that the musical starts with Lucchini hanging himself. And the judge, who's very godlike, that comes over the speakers and says, why did you kill her? And why did you do this? And so that's how the musical actually starts. So to get back to your question, because again, I could talk forever about this. It was a big cultural phenomenon at the time, tragic deaths, both women. She was in her early 60s, so older than Princess Di, but still young, okay, and probably would have lived at least another 10 or 15 years. She was in good health. She exercised regularly. She had exercise equipment set up in her different apartments, which is still there to see, which was very, you know, different and remarkable for the time, because women didn't exercise at that time at all. So that was something remarkable. So she probably would have lived for another 10, 15 years at least. So on the younger side. But yes, I hope that answers your question with a very long answer. All right, George has got one. Go ahead, George. think that's a very complex question. I think that if we're talking about pop artists, I think the first one that I can think of would be Madonna. If we're talking about women in general, do you mean like regular everyday women feeling societal pressure to adhere to whatever the feminine ideal is of the time? Is that what you're talking about? I think that's probably always existed. Like celebrities and yeah. I don't think it's something new, and I don't even think it originated with her. I think that, you know, every figurehead, whether they were, you know, a royal celebrity, so a celebrity through their royalty, or someone of note because of something they accomplished, I think they were always trying to stand out in some way. But I do think what's unique is that they very much intentionally crafted their image. And so they both must have had, and Taylor Swift definitely has, their finger on the pulse of society and what's important and what the public is looking for in a woman in that time period. And I think that happened throughout her life, and that's addressed in the book, and then it's happened since her death, using her image to align with that. I think is happening, and that's why, you know, that's one of the reasons I think why she's an interesting figure, and the figure that is chosen for this over and over again is because there are different aspects of her personality that historically have some basis in historical fact that can easily be molded to different imaginings and different iterations that fit with the zeitgeist of the time, with what I like to call is the feminine ideal. Like what is the most ideal version now? And I think now it's being independent, being a little bit more outspoken, still being very feminine though. So like that balance, and that is definitely shown, and that's what I'm hoping to talk about in the second part of the book. That very much is shown in some of these more recent iterations. She is very feminine, but very independent, much more so than, you know, the earlier films. And there's even, and this is a little kind of snapshot as to what I'm going to talk about. There's a lot of gender fluidity and interest in like lesbian relationships and homoerotic relationships with her in the newest iterations. That's not something, again, that anyone's ever seen. It's sissy, and that's why I want to see it. She apparently allegedly has a relationship, like a romantic relationship with her lady in waiting in this film. And that's what it's about, is their relationship. And that they even had a sexual relationship. So that's something that's really different from any of the other, you know, ways that she's been shown or represented in any of these other films. And that's also shown in the, I believe it's the RTL, the sissy RTL one. I watched both of them back to back, so it's hard for me to differentiate. But in that one, she actually hires, in the series, she hires a prostitute after she gets married to teach her how to be with her husband, which again has no basis in fact. But there's some scenes there where it's alluded to that there's, you know, an attraction between them. So it's interesting that now, you know, she has these very female dominant relationships that are sexual and very close, you know, and that she's more emotionally close to these women in these iterations than she is to her husband. So I think that tells us something. And I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. And I think it's even says it on the back of the book is, what does that tell us about ourselves as a society? What does that, it's a reflection of us, you know? So I think that definitely correlates with, you know, more of an acceptance overall more of an acceptance of LGBTQIA+, you know, rights and identities, and accepting that more as a society, more or less, you know. I think that's heavily influenced by that. Hope that answers your question. So that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about in part 2. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Pleasure.